A man vanished from his hometown for 5 long years. When he finally returned, he stood frozen in front of the land his ancestors had left him. The old wooden house was gone. In its place stood a 2-story mansion, complete with a swimming pool, a 3-car garage, and a towering stone gate. The woman who now claimed ownership, the most powerful figure in the homeowners association, simply smiled and told him that if a man disappears for that long, the land belongs to whoever knows how to use it. What she did not know was that Ethan Walker had never sold a single acre of that property. And 3 months later, standing before the entire town, a judge would speak one sentence that silenced every voice in the room. Tear it all down. The truck rattled along the familiar gravel road as Ethan Walker gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale from a tension that had nothing to do with driving. 42 years old, weathered by cold winds and long shifts on oil platforms near the Arctic Circle, he had spent half a decade working in places so remote that phone signals rarely reached him, and news from home arrived, if at all, months late. He had told himself the return would feel like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. Instead, as the trees thinned and the old fence posts came into view, his chest tightened with something closer to dread. He remembered running down this same road as a boy, his father calling him in for supper, his mother humming from the porch while she hung laundry beneath the oak tree that had stood at the edge of the property since before he was born. His parents were gone now, both of them, taken within 2 years of each other while Ethan was stationed thousands of miles away, unreachable, unaware until the letters finally caught up with him. The land had passed to him through their will, a simple document filed at the county courthouse, naming him as the sole heir to 11 acres and the modest wooden house his grandfather had built with his own hands. Ethan had always planned to come back eventually, to finish out his working years in the cold north, and then retire quietly on the property where he had learned to fish, to hunt, to listen to the wind moving through the pines. He pictured himself rebuilding the porch, replacing the roof, spending his evenings exactly where his childhood had unfolded. But as the truck rounded the final bend, none of that memory matched what stood before him. A steel gate, tall and imposing, blocked the entrance where a simple wire fence used to hang loose between wooden posts. Security cameras perched on either side of the gate, their lenses catching the afternoon light. Beyond the barrier, where the old house should have been, rose a mansion unlike anything that belonged in this quiet corner of the county, 2 stories of pale stone and glass, a swimming pool shimmering blue beside a manicured lawn, and a garage large enough to hold 3 vehicles. Ethan sat in his truck for a long moment, engine idling, absolutely certain he had somehow taken a wrong turn. He had not. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching against a newly paved driveway that had replaced the dirt path his father used to walk every morning. There was no trace of the wooden house, not a single beam, not a foundation stone, nothing to suggest that a family had once lived and loved and grieved on this very ground. The oak tree, at least, still stood near the property line, its branches wider now, its trunk thicker, the only living witness to everything that had been erased. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, not from anger yet, but from a disorientation so total that for a moment he wondered if the years away had somehow scrambled his own memory. He walked slowly along the fence line, running a hand over the cold steel bars, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had carried in his mind through 5 long winters. Somewhere beneath that pale stone foundation, he thought, lay the exact ground where his father had taught him to split firewood, where his mother had planted tomatoes every spring without fail. It felt less like trespassing, and more like standing inside someone else's memory of a place that had once belonged entirely to him. He walked toward the gate, and that was when the front door of the mansion opened. A woman emerged, sharp heels clicking against the stone steps, sunglasses pushed up into perfectly styled hair. She moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in a room or on a piece of land. Karen Whitmore, 50 years old, president of the Homeowners Association for the surrounding development, crossed her arms as she studied the stranger standing uninvited at what she considered her gate. She did not recognize him, and in her mind, that alone was reason enough to be suspicious. Her voice, when it came, carried the practiced coolness of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. She told him this was private property, that he needed to leave immediately, and that trespassers were reported to the police without warning in this community. Ethan did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, worn soft at the creases from years of being carried across continents, the deed to the land bearing his name and his father's name before him. He held it toward the gate, close enough for her to read, and explained calmly that this was his family's property, that he had been away working, and that he had returned to find someone had built an entire estate on land that had never left his ownership. Karen barely glanced at the paper before laughing, a short, dismissive sound that carried no warmth at all. She informed him that the homeowners association had taken over the parcel years earlier, that it had been abandoned, unmaintained, a liability to the neighborhood, and that the community had voted, informally at least, to allow development in the interest of property values. She spoke as though reciting a script she had used before, confident that the sheer scale of what she had built would be argument enough. Behind her, a few neighbors had begun to gather at the edge of their lawns, drawn by the raised voices and the unfamiliar truck parked outside the Whitmore estate. Some of them exchanged amused glances, whispering to one another as though watching a mildly entertaining spectacle rather than a man discovering his childhood home had been demolished without his knowledge. One neighbor lifted a phone and began recording, more out of habit than concern. Karen, emboldened by the small audience, told Ethan that if he did not leave the premises within the next few minutes, she would personally call the sheriff and have him removed as a trespasser on her property. There was something almost theatrical in the way she said it, as though she believed the mere threat would be enough to send him running. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then looked past her at the mansion swallowing the space where his childhood home used to stand, and he felt something settle inside him, not panic, but a quiet, deliberate resolve. He folded the deed carefully, placed it back inside his jacket, and without another word, turned and walked back to his truck. He did not argue. He did not raise his fists or his voice. He simply drove away, leaving Karen standing at her gate with a satisfied expression, certain she had won a battle that, as far as she knew, had barely begun. Ethan checked into a small motel on the edge of town that night, the kind of place with thin walls and a flickering neon sign, and he lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, running through everything he had just witnessed. He thought about his father's calloused hands laying the foundation beams of that old house, about his mother's voice calling him in from the yard at dusk, about the promise he had quietly made to himself somewhere on a frozen platform in the Arctic that he would come home someday and finish what his family had started. None of it made sense against the image of that gleaming mansion sitting where his childhood had once stood. He was not a man given to rage, but that night, something steady and cold settled into his chest, a resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with simply refusing to accept a lie, no matter how expensive or well-built that lie happened to be. He thought, too, about the neighbors who had watched the confrontation unfold, some of them laughing, some of them filming, none of them stepping forward to ask a single honest question about who actually owned the land beneath that mansion. It struck him as strange, the way an entire community could accept a story simply because it was told with enough confidence and repeated often enough among people eager to believe it. He decided, lying there in the dark, that he would not raise his voice to convince anyone of anything. He would let the documents speak for him instead, because documents, unlike people, did not change their story depending on who was in the room. The following morning, Ethan sat across from Daniel Ross, an attorney in his mid-50s whose office walls were lined with law degrees and faded photographs of courtroom victories from decades past. Daniel had known Ethan's father years earlier, had handled small legal matters for the family long before Ethan left for the oil fields, and he listened with growing disbelief as Ethan recounted what he had found upon his return. Together they pulled the county records, cross-referencing tax filings, land surveys, and zoning permits stretching back the full 5 years of Ethan's absence. What they discovered confirmed everything Ethan already suspected and yet still managed to shock him. The deed had never changed hands. Not once during those 5 years had ownership of the 11 acres transferred to anyone, not to Karen Whitmore, not to the homeowners association, not to any development company or trust. Property taxes, it turned out, had continued to be paid automatically through an account Ethan's late father had set up years earlier, a detail Ethan himself had forgotten about until Daniel pulled the payment history. There had been no foreclosure, no auction, no legal seizure of any kind. As far as the county was concerned, Ethan Walker remained, and had always remained, the sole legal owner of the land. Daniel leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he always did when a case revealed itself to be far more serious than it first appeared. He told Ethan plainly that someone had built an entire estate, likely worth well over $1 million, on land they had absolutely no legal claim to whatsoever. It was not a matter of a disputed boundary line or an honest misunderstanding about property markers. It was, in the clearest possible terms, construction on land that never belonged to the person who built on it. Ethan asked what that meant for him, and Daniel answered without hesitation that it meant Ethan had every right to reclaim what was his, and quite possibly a great deal more. Ethan did not need long to decide. He authorized Daniel to file suit against Karen Whitmore and, depending on what the investigation uncovered, potentially against the homeowners association itself. Daniel warned him gently that a case of this size, involving a fully constructed estate and a fiercely defended association board, would not resolve quickly or quietly, and told him to expect resistance, delay, and a fight far uglier than an ordinary property dispute. Ethan listened without flinching, having spent 5 years in conditions where patience was not a virtue but a survival skill, and told Daniel plainly that he was in no hurry, having already waited 5 years without even knowing there was anything to wait for. That evening, Ethan drove back out to the edge of the property, parking well beyond the steel gate where the cameras could not easily reach him, and sat quietly watching the sun set behind the mansion that did not belong there. He noticed how carefully the landscaping had been arranged, how every hedge and stone path seemed designed to project permanence, as though enough polish could erase the fact that none of it had ever been legally built. He filed the observation away, understanding, from years spent reading equipment gauges in freezing conditions, that the smallest details often told the truest story. Word of the impending lawsuit reached Karen within days, carried through the small network of gossip that moved faster than any official notice ever could in a town this size. Karen's response was immediate and calculated. She called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association, gathering members in the community clubhouse under the guise of addressing what she described as a serious threat to the neighborhood. Standing before rows of folding chairs, she painted Ethan as a greedy outsider, a man who had abandoned his own family's land for 5 years, and was now returning only because he saw an opportunity to seize a valuable, fully developed property that other people had poured their time and money into. She reminded the room, again and again, that the estate represented not just her investment but the reputation and property values of the entire community. Many of the members, trusting her without question, nodded along, murmuring agreement, already forming opinions about a man most of them had never actually met. One elderly resident near the back of the room raised a hand and asked, quietly, whether anyone had actually seen the paperwork proving the association's claim to the land. Karen brushed the question aside with practiced ease, telling the room that legal matters were being handled appropriately and that the community's focus should remain on protecting what had already been built, rather than entertaining doubts, stirred up by a man who had been absent for half a decade. The room, eager for reassurance, accepted her answer without pressing further, and the meeting closed with a scattered round of applause that left Karen visibly satisfied. Karen wasted no time securing legal representation of her own, hiring Melissa Grant, a well-regarded attorney known throughout the region for her aggressive courtroom style and her rarely broken winning streak. In private conversations, Karen expressed complete confidence that no judge, regardless of the paperwork involved, would ever order the demolition of a home worth well over $1 million. She believed, quite sincerely, that the sheer financial scale of what she had built would make any court hesitant to act, that practicality would win out over technicality, and that Ethan would eventually grow tired of the fight and accept a settlement far smaller than what the land was actually worth. While Karen rallied her supporters and prepared her legal defense, Ethan worked quietly in the background, methodical in a way that mirrored the discipline he had learned during his years on remote drilling platforms, where a single overlooked detail could cost lives. Daniel Ross began compiling every piece of documentation available, requesting copies of internal homeowners association, emails, meeting minutes stretching back years, building permits filed with the county, and zoning applications submitted during the period Ethan had been away. Buried within stacks of routine paperwork, something began to surface, something that suggested the story Karen had been telling her neighbors was far from the whole truth. Ethan spent evenings at Daniel's office sorting through boxes of printed emails and meeting notes, cross-checking dates against a timeline he had drawn out on a legal pad, matching each document to the exact month it had been filed. It was slow, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic confrontation people might have imagined, but Ethan approached it the same way he approached equipment failures on the platform, trusting that patience and precision would eventually reveal whatever had been hidden. Melissa Grant, for her part, remained publicly dismissive of the lawsuit whenever reporters or curious neighbors asked, describing it as a minor technical dispute that would be resolved quickly in her client's favor. Privately, however, she had begun requesting additional documentation from Karen, unsettled by how few clear answers she was receiving whenever she asked pointed questions about the original permit application. Karen brushed off each request, insisting the matter had already been handled years earlier, and that there was no need to revisit old paperwork now. It came first from a building inspector named Gregory Hale, a man who had spent nearly 20 years reviewing construction permits for the county and had grown too experienced to be easily intimidated by anyone, regardless of their standing in the community. When Daniel Ross requested his records under a formal subpoena, Gregory did not hesitate to cooperate fully. He confirmed that Karen Whitmore had indeed submitted an application to build on the parcel of land years earlier, shortly after Ethan had left for Alaska. The application, however, had been formally denied, and the reason for that denial was recorded in black and white within the county files. Karen Whitmore was not, and had never been, the legal owner of the property in question. Gregory recalled the moment clearly, telling Daniel that the denial had been unusually straightforward, a simple matter of the applicant, lacking any recorded deed or transfer document to support the request. He remembered thinking at the time that the file would likely never move forward again given how clear-cut the rejection had been, and he admitted a genuine surprise years later when a completed mansion appeared on a satellite image of that same parcel during a routine county review. That should have ended the matter entirely. Yet somehow, construction had proceeded regardless, and a completed mansion now stood on land the county itself had already acknowledged, in writing, did not belong to her. As Daniel dug further, a second, far more troubling document surfaced from deep within the county archive. It was a supposed amended permit, filed roughly a year after the original rejection, this time apparently approved. On its surface, the amended file appeared legitimate, complete with an official signature, authorizing construction to move forward. But something about the signature caught Gregory Hale's attention the moment he examined it closely. The name belonged to a county official who had retired from public service nearly 3 years before that particular document was supposedly signed. It was not simply an outdated record or a clerical oversight. It was, in every sense that mattered, a forged authorization, created to make an illegal construction project appear lawful on paper. Alongside the falsified signature, Daniel discovered an altered property map, its boundary lines subtly redrawn to suggest, misleadingly, that the parcel fell under different jurisdictional rules than it actually did. Ethan sat in stunned silence as Daniel laid the documents across his desk one by one. This was no longer simply a dispute over land occupied during his absence. It had become something far more serious, a deliberate scheme involving forged government records and knowingly false permits, all constructed to justify building an entire estate atop land that legally, unmistakably, still belonged to him. Daniel began tracing the chain of documents backward, determined to establish exactly who had created the forged signature, who had approved the falsified map, and how deeply the deception ran through the homeowners association records. Every new piece of evidence he uncovered pointed with increasing clarity toward one name at the center of it all. The first hearing arrived on a cold, overcast morning, and the courthouse steps were crowded with residents from the community, many of them curious onlookers who had heard whispers of the case circulating for weeks. Karen Whitmore walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her chin lifted, radiating the same unwavering confidence she had shown at her gate months earlier. She had convinced herself, and largely convinced her attorney as well, that no reasonable court would ever order the destruction of a home worth well over $1 million, regardless of how the paperwork read on its face. Melissa Grant opened for the defense with practiced polish, arguing that Ethan Walker had effectively abandoned the property for 5 uninterrupted years, that the surrounding community had benefited enormously from the development that replaced an old, deteriorating structure, that Karen Whitmore had invested substantial personal wealth in good faith, and that demolishing a completed, occupied residence would cause damage grossly disproportionate to any harm Ethan had actually suffered. She spoke of property values, of community improvement, of the practical absurdity of tearing down a mansion over what she characterized as a technical ownership dispute. It was, on its surface, a persuasive argument, delivered with the confident cadence of an attorney who rarely lost, and several reporters seated near the back of the gallery could be seen nodding along as she spoke, already imagining the headline about a demolished mansion that never should have been ordered destroyed in the first place. Even Ethan, seated quietly beside Daniel Ross with his hands folded in his lap, felt a brief flicker of doubt as he listened to how convincingly the argument was framed, though the feeling passed the moment he reminded himself that persuasion, however polished, was never the same thing as ownership. Then Daniel Ross rose from his seat, and rather than launching into a lengthy rebuttal, he asked a single, simple question directed at Karen Whitmore herself. He asked her plainly whether she actually held legal ownership of the land beneath the estate she had built. The courtroom fell into an immediate, uncomfortable silence. Karen glanced toward Melissa Grant, who glanced back with no ready answer prepared, because there was no honest answer that could be given. The truth, as the earlier document discovery had already established, was that she never had, and Melissa's carefully constructed argument about community benefit and financial investment suddenly felt like it was standing on nothing at all. Judge Eleanor Brooks, 62 years old, and known throughout the region for a reputation of unflinching fairness built over more than 3 decades on the bench, studied both attorneys with an expression that revealed nothing of her thinking. She addressed the defense directly, instructing them to produce any documentation establishing legitimate ownership or lawful transfer of the property to Karen Whitmore at any point during the relevant period. Melissa Grant requested a brief recess to consult with her client, and when the hearing resumed, she was forced to admit that no such documentation existed within the defense's records. The judge noted the admission for the file without comment, her expression still unreadable, and adjourned the session for the day, but something in the courtroom had visibly shifted. The absolute certainty Karen had carried through the courthouse doors that morning had begun, however slightly, to crack. In the weeks that followed, as Daniel Ross continued building his case, an unexpected witness came forward entirely on her own initiative. Patricia Owens, a former administrative employee of the Homeowners Association who had resigned from her position roughly 2 years earlier over what she described only as ethical disagreements with leadership, contacted Daniel's office directly and asked to testify. Under oath, she recounted conversations from her time working alongside Karen Whitmore, describing internal discussions about the Walker property that painted a picture strikingly different from the version Karen had presented to the community. Patricia testified that Karen had known, clearly and unambiguously, from the very beginning, that the land did not belong to her or to the association. She recalled Karen dismissing early concerns raised by association members about the legality of building on the parcel, telling colleagues at the time that Ethan Walker was gone, that a man who disappears for years without any real contact with the community effectively surrenders any real claim to return and challenge what had been built in his absence. Patricia testified that Karen had spoken those words with total confidence, as though the mere passage of time would be sufficient to erase Ethan's legal rights entirely. Melissa Grant tried to suggest during cross-examination that Patricia's testimony was driven by resentment over her departure from the association, but Patricia calmly explained that she had resigned voluntarily on her own terms, specifically because she had refused to sign off on paperwork she believed to be fraudulent, and that she had kept dated notes of her own objections precisely because she suspected this day might eventually come. Shortly after Patricia's testimony, a local contractor named Robert Callahan, who had worked on portions of the estate's construction, was called to the stand as well. Robert testified that he had personally raised concerns with Karen early in the project, warning her explicitly that the property records he had reviewed did not list her as the legal owner, and recommending she resolve the ownership question through proper legal channels before construction proceeded any further. He testified that Karen had waved away his concerns, telling him to continue the work regardless, insisting that any issue with the paperwork was, in her words, a formality that would sort itself out eventually. Robert added, almost as an afterthought, that he had kept copies of his own written estimates and correspondence, specifically because something about the arrangement had felt wrong to him from the start, and that instinct had led him to protect himself with documentation long before anyone had mentioned a lawsuit. Melissa Grant attempted to challenge his credibility on cross-examination, suggesting his account was colored by a dispute over unpaid invoices, but Robert calmly produced the paid receipts himself, closing off that line of questioning entirely. Sitting in the courtroom gallery, watching witness after witness confirm what she had spent months trying to deny, Karen's composure began visibly unraveling. The confident, dismissive woman who had once laughed at Ethan's deed by the gate now sat rigid, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as the walls of her carefully constructed story continued to collapse around her. When it came time for Daniel Ross to present his final body of evidence, he moved through the courtroom with the calm precision of a man who had already won the case in every meaningful sense and was simply finishing the formalities. He entered into the record the original deed bearing Ethan Walker's name, uninterrupted for decades, alongside 5 consecutive years of property tax filings showing continuous ownership throughout Ethan's entire absence. He introduced satellite imagery, time-stamped and independently verified, tracing the transformation of the property from an empty lot to a fully constructed mansion across a clear and specific timeline. He submitted GPS survey data confirming, beyond any reasonable dispute, that the mansion sat squarely within the boundaries of Ethan's legally recorded parcel. He entered Gregory Hale's official record of the county's original permit denial, the very denial that should have stopped construction before it ever began. Then, with the same measured calm, Daniel introduced a printed email, retrieved during discovery from Karen Whitmore's own association account, dated well over a year before Ethan's return. In it, discussing the ongoing construction with another board member who had apparently raised a lingering concern about the ownership question, Karen had written that if Ethan Walker ever actually came back, they would deal with the situation at that point, but that for now, the project needed to keep moving forward exactly as planned. Daniel read the words aloud slowly, deliberately, allowing each phrase to settle fully into the silence of the courtroom. There was no ambiguity left in the room, no reasonable explanation Karen or her attorney could offer. She had known from the very beginning, in writing, in her own words, that the land was not hers, and she had chosen to build anyway, gambling that Ethan would simply never come home to stop her. Watching the printed page pass into the judge's hands, Karen sat utterly still, all color drained from her face, finally confronted with undeniable, irrefutable proof of exactly what she had done. Melissa Grant attempted, briefly, to argue that the email had been taken out of context, that the phrase could be interpreted as a general reference to future negotiations rather than an admission of wrongdoing. Judge Brooks allowed the argument to be made in full before responding, in a tone that remained calm but left no room for further debate, that a written statement acknowledging an owner might one day return to reclaim his own land was, by its very nature, an acknowledgement that the land belonged to someone else in the first place. The courtroom remained silent, as the judge instructed the clerk to formally enter the email into evidence, and even Melissa Grant, normally quick to press an advantage, chose not to pursue the point any further. Judge Eleanor Brooks took several days before returning to deliver her ruling, a decision she made clear was necessary given both the scale of the property involved and the seriousness of the fraudulent conduct the evidence had revealed. When the courtroom reconvened, it was filled well beyond its usual capacity. Residents from across the community packed into the gallery, drawn by weeks of mounting local talk about the case that had, by then, become the most discussed matter the town had seen in years. Karen sat beside Melissa Grant, her posture stiff, her earlier confidence long since replaced by a visible, quiet dread. The judge began methodically, walking through each element of the case with the careful precision the courtroom had come to expect from her over 3 decades on the bench. She confirmed, without room for dispute, that Ethan Walker had held continuous, uninterrupted legal ownership of the property throughout the entire period in question. She confirmed that Karen Whitmore had constructed a residential estate on that land without any legal claim to it whatsoever, and had done so despite an explicit, documented denial of her original permit application from the county. She confirmed that Karen had subsequently relied upon a forged signature and an altered property map to create the illusion of lawful authorization where none had ever actually existed. And she confirmed, based on both witness testimony and Karen's own written correspondence, that Karen had known throughout the entire process, with total clarity, that she possessed no legitimate right to build on that land at all. At one point, Melissa Grant rose and attempted a final argument, urging the court to consider financial restitution as an alternative to demolition, emphasizing the extraordinary monetary value of the completed estate and the practical hardship that destroying it would represent. Judge Brooks listened patiently, then responded with a single line that would be repeated throughout the town for months afterward. She stated plainly that the law does not reward those who knowingly and deliberately violate it, regardless of how much money they choose to spend in the process. The ruling that followed was comprehensive and unambiguous in every respect. Full legal ownership of the property was to be restored immediately and entirely to Ethan Walker. Karen Whitmore was ordered to bear the complete financial cost of demolition. She was further ordered to pay substantial damages to Ethan for the destruction of his family home and the years of lost use of the land itself. And in a final significant provision, the judge ruled that the Homeowners Association bore civil liability as well, for having overstepped its lawful authority and for having failed, despite clear internal warnings, to intervene when it became apparent that its own president was constructing an estate on land that did not belong to her. Judge Brooks paused before closing the hearing, addressing the packed courtroom directly rather than simply the 2 parties before her. She reminded everyone present that a community association, however well-intentioned, held no authority whatsoever to override the legally recorded rights of a private landowner, regardless of how long that owner had been away or how convenient it might seem to assume otherwise. She stated that the ruling was not merely about one mansion or one falsified permit, but about preserving the basic principle that ownership, once lawfully established, could not simply be reassigned by community consensus or personal ambition. With that, she instructed the court to proceed with formal demolition orders within 90 days, giving Karen Whitmore a narrow window to appeal, an option her own attorney quietly advised her against pursuing given the strength of the evidence already on record. 3 months later, on a clear autumn morning, heavy machinery rolled slowly up the very driveway where Ethan had once stood, stunned, staring at a mansion that should never have existed. Word of the demolition had spread quickly through the small town, and a quiet crowd gathered along the road at a respectful distance, watching in near total silence as the excavator's arm rose and made its first strike against the stone facade. What had once stood as a glittering symbol of wealth and unchecked authority within the community slowly folded inward, floor by floor, wall by wall, collapsing over the course of the day into an unremarkable pile of broken stone and twisted metal. There was no cheering from the crowd, no celebration, only a heavy, contemplative stillness, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing something far larger than the simple destruction of a building. Karen Whitmore was not present to see it. In the weeks following the ruling, she had resigned, under significant pressure, from her position as president of the Homeowners Association, a role she had held with such visible pride for the better part of a decade. Several former board members, once among her most loyal and vocal supporters, later approached Ethan directly to offer their sincere apologies, admitting openly that they had trusted Karen's version of events without question, and had failed to look more closely at the truth sitting quietly in the public record the entire time. Ethan accepted each apology with a quiet, understated grace, showing no interest whatsoever in prolonging the conflict or extracting any further satisfaction from those who had simply believed a confident, persuasive lie. One of those former board members, an older man named Walter Higgins who had sat on the association board for nearly 15 years, told Ethan privately that the entire ordeal had taught him something he should have understood long before. He said that people in positions of authority within a small community often mistake confidence for legitimacy, and that it had taken watching a judge dismantle Karen's story piece by piece to remind him that titles and polished appearances mean nothing without the paperwork to support them. Ethan thanked him for the honesty and told him there were no hard feelings, that most people simply believe what they are told by someone who sounds certain enough, and that the fault for that rarely belonged to the ones who were deceived. News of the ruling eventually reached beyond the town itself, picked up briefly by a regional newspaper covering unusual property disputes, and for a short time strangers from neighboring counties would drive past the cleared lot simply to see the place where a mansion had once stood before it was ordered torn down. Ethan paid little attention to the attention itself. He was far more concerned with the quiet, practical business of restoring the land to something resembling what it had once been, clearing debris, testing the soil, walking the property line inch by inch to make certain the boundaries recorded on paper matched exactly what he saw standing in front of him. Ethan did not celebrate the day the demolition finally finished. He drove out to the property that evening, once the machinery had gone quiet and the crew had left for the night, and he stood alone on the cleared, empty land where his childhood home once stood and where, for a short and painful time, someone else's mansion had stood in its place. The old oak tree remained exactly where it always had, its wide branches stretching out over ground that had finally, truly, been returned to him. He had specifically instructed the demolition crew to work carefully around its roots, unwilling to lose the one living piece of his family's history that had somehow managed to survive everything else that came before. A full year passed before Ethan began building again, and when he finally did, he chose to build something small and unassuming, a modest wooden house with a wide covered porch, positioned to look out over the quiet lake at the edge of the property, much like the very first home his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands generations earlier. He hired a local crew for the project, insisted on filing every permit through the proper channels without exception, and made a point of personally verifying each piece of paperwork himself before construction ever began, determined that nothing about this new chapter would ever be built on a foundation of doubt or deception. He chose a spot close enough to the oak tree that its shade would fall across the porch in the late afternoon, exactly as it once had for his father, and on the evening the final board was nailed into place. He sat alone on the steps and allowed himself, for the first time in a very long while, a quiet and genuine sense of peace. Residents driving past the quiet lakeside property today still occasionally slow their cars, glancing toward the modest wooden house with its covered porch, and many of them recall the story that unfolded there of a man who vanished for 5 years only to return and find his birthright stolen from beneath him. They remember the mansion that briefly rose in defiance of the law, and they remember, most vividly of all, the single sentence a judge spoke that finally brought the matter to its rightful, unavoidable end. It has become, in its own quiet way, a lasting lesson passed down through the town, a reminder that authority within a community, however confidently claimed or loudly asserted, can never truly substitute for lawful ownership. A person may attempt to claim land through concrete, through wealth, through sheer force of confidence and social standing, but possession obtained through deception can never be transformed into a genuine right simply because enough time has quietly passed. When the truth is finally proven before the law, justice may indeed arrive late, yet it still holds the power to order that whatever was wrongfully built must, in the end, come down.